In the years following the end of the Second World War, Texas City was seen as a symbol of American prosperity and progress. Located along the Gulf Coast on Galveston Bay, it had quickly become an industrial powerhouse fueled by its growing network of chemical plants, oil refineries, and a busy deepwater port. The constant hum of machinery, the sight of smoke rising steadily from refinery stacks, and the clanging of steel against steel were all considered signs of economic promise. Families had moved there from across the country, drawn by good wages and steady work in a region that seemed destined to shape the nation's future. The port was central to this success, exporting materials that supported rebuilding efforts in Europe and supplying fuel to power post-war expansion across the United States. Every ship that docked in Texas City represented jobs, opportunity, and civic pride. Tied to the pier in mid-April was a French vessel named the SS Grand Camp. It had arrived to load a chemical that at the time was considered harmless and beneficial. This chemical was ammonium nitrate fertilizer, produced to help revive crops in war-torn countries overseas. Thousands of tons of it were being packed tightly into the ship's cargo holds, sealed in paper sacks stacked high in the dim and confined interior. The product had been widely used for agriculture and was transported regularly through the ports across the world. In Texas City, it was viewed simply as another export, ordinary, unthreatening, and profitable. There was no alarm and no sense of danger. Yet while the town moved through its normal morning routine, changes were already happening deep inside the cargo hold of the Grand Camp. Temperatures were rising, the chemical was beginning to react, and a chain of events had quietly begun, one that would soon transform an ordinary working port into the site of a national tragedy unlike anything the country had ever witnessed. By early morning, faint wisps of smoke began to rise from the cargo hold of the SS Grand Camp. Crew members attempted to control the smoldering chemical by closing the hatches and injecting steam into the hold, hoping to smother the heat. This was a common practice at the time for preventing fires, but ammonium nitrate did not behave like ordinary cargo. Instead of cooling the smoldering material, the steam accelerated the chemical reaction, causing internal pressure to rise. On the dock, longshoremen and port workers noticed the ship's metal sides beginning to bulge slightly, an unusual sign that something was building inside the sealed compartments. Despite the smoke, there was no immediate evacuation. Children were on their way to school. Office workers had just sat down at their desks. Many residents, curious about the smoke, walked toward the waterfront to get a better view. Some recalled hearing popping sounds coming from the ship's interior, a warning sign that went unrecognized. Moments later, at approximately 9 a.m, the chemical reached a critical temperature. The Grand Camp erupted in a catastrophic explosion, sending a massive fireball into the sky and shaking the ground with the force of a small wartime bomb. Witnesses miles away reported seeing windows shatter and debris falling from the sky. The blast instantly destroyed the ship, blasted a crater into the port, and hurled the anchor made of solid steel over a mile inland. Burning metal fragments rained across the industrial district, igniting oil storage tanks and chemical facilities near the shoreline. The wave of hot air scorched everything in its path, while a shock wave flattened buildings, warehouses, and railroad cars. Firefighters who had rushed to the scene were caught in the explosion, and nearly all of the city's firefighting equipment was destroyed in an instant. The blast was so powerful that residents in neighboring communities, including Galveston and Houston, felt the force and believed an earthquake or an enemy attack had occurred. At that moment, Texas City was transformed from a prosperous port community into a disaster zone. Fires broke out across the city, emergency communication lines were disabled, and thick smoke began to blanket the area as a second threat quietly developed nearby, another ship carrying the same volatile cargo. In the immediate aftermath of the Grand Camp explosion, Texas City was thrown into complete disarray. Communication systems were crippled, telephone lines were severed, and emergency coordination became nearly impossible. Fires raged across industrial plants along the waterfront, feeding on crude oil, chemicals, and debris ignited by flaming shrapnel. Thick black smoke rose into the sky, darkening the morning sun and making visibility difficult for rescue workers. Many of the city's firefighters had perished in the blast, leaving Texas City without its primary line of defense just as new fires began to take hold. The situation grew even more alarming when emergency responders realized that a second vessel, the SS High Flyer, was also carrying a large quantity of ammonium nitrate and was now on fire. Throughout the port, confusion turned into panic. Rail yards filled with fuel tankers started to detonate from the intense heat, causing chains of secondary explosions. Industrial facilities containing benzene and other dangerous chemicals began to erupt one after another, creating shockwaves that traveled through the air like rolling thunder. The force of the explosions shattered glass miles away and knocked people off their feet, even in surrounding towns. Roads leading into the city became clogged with vehicles as people tried to flee, while others rushed in searching for loved ones. The hospitals quickly became overwhelmed, and makeshift triage stations were set up in schools, churches, and parking lots. Medical personnel from nearby cities were called in, but even with reinforcements, there were not enough supplies or space to treat everyone in need. Meanwhile, the SS High Flyer continued to burn. Emergency crews attempted to cut it loose from the docks and tow it away to prevent another catastrophic blast. Hours passed as workers struggled against spreading fires, damaged equipment, and dangerous fumes. Despite their efforts, the fire on the second ship reached its critical point. Late into the night, the High Flyer exploded with nearly the same force as the Grand Camp, compounding the devastation. This second blast shattered any remaining infrastructure, ignited fresh fires across the city, and destroyed additional sections of the port. The two explosions together created one of the most destructive industrial disasters in American history, leaving much of Texas City unrecognizable as the sun set on a day of unimaginable destruction. By the morning after the second explosion, Texas City no longer resembled a functioning community. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to twisted metal, splintered wood, and scorched earth. The port district had vanished into a landscape of craters and smoldering debris. Fires still burned across oil refineries and chemical storage tanks, sending columns of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. The scale of destruction made navigation difficult, forcing rescue workers to climb over rubble and sift through wreckage by hand. Many roads were blocked by fallen structures, and the air was thick with toxic fumes from chemicals that continued to burn uncontrolled. Within hours, emergency aid began arriving from across the state of Texas and beyond. The American Red Cross established supply stations, providing food, clothing, and medical equipment to survivors. The United States military deployed personnel to assist with recovery efforts, bringing heavy machinery to clear debris and search for missing persons. Temporary morgues were constructed as the death toll rose steadily, with victims identified from personal items because official records had been destroyed. Families searched silently among the ruins, hoping to find any sign of their loved ones. Despite the massive response, there were not enough hospital beds, and many injured citizens had to be transported to cities such as Galveston and Houston for treatment. The disaster also triggered widespread environmental damage. Chemicals spilled into Galveston Bay, killing fish and disrupting the ecosystem. Burning oil flowed into waterways, creating floating slicks that caught fire and spread flames along the shoreline. Air quality was severely compromised, forcing residents to cover their faces with cloth to breathe. Livestock that survived the explosions began to suffer illness from contaminated water sources. In some areas, fires burned for nearly a week before finally being brought under control. Texas City became a scene of continuous emergency operations, with rescue, cleanup, and humanitarian efforts running simultaneously around the clock. As authorities began to assess the situation, it became clear that thousands of people had been left homeless. Entire blocks of houses had been flattened, and what remained was unsafe to inhabit. The loss of infrastructure meant that electricity, water, and sanitation systems were inoperable. The federal government declared the disaster one of the most severe in the nation's history, prompting a large-scale coordinated relief effort. Yet even as the fires were gradually extinguished, the people of Texas City were only beginning to comprehend the full extent of what had happened. The final challenge lay ahead, rebuilding lives, restoring the city, and seeking answers about how such a catastrophe had been allowed to occur. In the months that followed the Texas City disaster, investigators from federal and state agencies examined every detail of the explosions to determine the root cause. The use of ammonium nitrate as cargo was not new, but this catastrophe exposed the dangers of transporting it in bulk without proper safeguards. Reports confirmed that the chemical had been stored in paper sacks within a sealed cargo hold, creating ideal conditions for a rapid buildup of heat and pressure. The disaster prompted widespread scrutiny of industrial safety regulations and forced lawmakers to confront the lack of oversight in maritime shipping and chemical handling. What emerged from these investigations would permanently reshape emergency planning and industry standards across the United States. The human cost was staggering. Thousands were injured, and the official death toll climbed into the hundreds, though the true number was likely higher due to unidentifiable remains. Entire families were lost. The city faced a long and painful rebuilding process that would take years to complete. Donations poured in from across the country, and charitable organizations helped provide temporary housing and basic necessities. Texas City's citizens, many of whom had lost loved ones, homes, or livelihoods, came together in acts of resilience and determination. Despite overwhelming grief, they refused to abandon their community. Legal battles soon followed. Survivors and families of the deceased filed lawsuits against the United States government, arguing that the ammonium nitrate had been manufactured and shipped without adequate warning of its explosive potential. This led to a landmark Supreme Court case that ultimately ruled against the claimants, citing government immunity. Even though financial compensation was limited, the case brought national attention to the responsibilities of both government agencies and private industries in preventing such disasters. This attention spurred changes in federal law that required clearer labeling, improved packaging, and stricter regulation of hazardous materials. Over time, the Texas City disaster came to be known as one of the deadliest industrial accidents in American history. It served as a turning point for workplace safety, disaster response, and chemical regulation. Communities across the nation began implementing evacuation plans, emergency drills, and hazard awareness programs to prevent similar tragedies. Refineries and chemical plants upgraded their safety protocols, and the shipping industry adopted new standards for the storage and transportation of explosive materials. Though the city eventually rebuilt, the memory of that day remained etched into its identity. The legacy of the Texas City disaster was not one of destruction alone. It was also a story of transformation. Out of unimaginable loss came significant progress in public safety, emergency management, and industrial accountability. The disaster served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of complacency and the importance of preparedness. Texas City rebuilt stronger, and its story continues to stand as a powerful lesson of how a single event can change the course of a nation's history.